part of the difficulty for us and for our readers is in some way we're leading them to the mirror and saying, this is the real Jewish community, not necessarily the one we like to think about, that we are one and we only do wonderful things.
This is Faith Complex, a dialogue about the entanglement of religion, politics and art.
Hello, my name is Jacques Rosenblatt of Georgetown University, and you're watching Faith Complex. Joining us today is the award-winning journalist and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Jewish Week, Mr. Gary Rosenblatt. Welcome to Faith Complex, Mr. Rosenblatt.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, it's the 10-year anniversary of one of your most famous pieces, one of your biggest contributions to Jewish journalism, had to do with an Orthodox rabbi and, regrettably, a case of sexual abuse. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure. I think it's a familiar, all too familiar theme these days of a member of the clergy who is abusing young people and turns out is being protected in some ways by the religious superiors. And in this case, it was a rabbi who was the head of a national youth organization working with teens. And remarkably, he was accused for over 30 years. These allegations were coming up from young people he was working with.
What was his name?
Baruch Lanner.
I see. And the victims were generally 12, 13, 14-year-old kids in his...
Sometimes a little older, but teenagers and boys and girls, different types of abuse. But he's a brilliant rabbi, scholar, very charismatic. And even some of his victims have said that they went into Jewish studies and professional fields in Jewish education partly as a result of his teaching. And you were the person who broke the story? Yeah, one of the victims approached me. This was back in 2000, and I ended up spending about 7 months interviewing people. And again, if we're talking about 30 years, there were literally hundreds of victims, and ultimately he was investigated. He was fired as a result of the article, and he was investigated and brought to trial and convicted and served a jail sentence. Now, back then, the Orthodox Union, or the umbrella organization of Orthodox Judaism, if I understand correctly, pleaded with you not to publish the story. Is that correct? Well, it was more implicit. Obviously, in spending that amount of time working on the story, people got wind of it. I attempted to interview the rabbi himself, but he didn't want to talk with me, and spoke to his superiors soon before the article ran. And so there were sort of offers made. At one point I said, well, we'll have them work with college students instead. But I didn't feel that my role as a journalist was to make deals, or that wasn't my job. So we published the story. Dan Rather once said, report and be damned. That's my job. Is that your job? Well, so I had both. You were damned. Well, we reported, and I have to say, in terms of the general readership of the paper, it was very supportive. I think they felt that we did the right thing. But as I mentioned, in terms of some of the rabbinic colleagues, there was a reaction, critical. And again, I think the undercurrent here is in relationship to the Vatican Church scandal with priests. In no way is it a kind of proportional parallel, but in terms of some of the responses and reactions, it was blame the media, and you had the added issue of Lashon Hara. Translate that for our viewers who might not know what it means. I guess it's a Jewish concept, a prohibition of spreading gossip. Every Jewish person I know spreads gossip. I don't know what Chafetz Chaim was thinking, but I spread gossip all the time. I'm not sure. Well, the Chafetz Chaim is a rabbi who's most famous for writing on the subject about 100 years ago. And I think he had a very good insight into human nature, because he said you're not only not supposed to speak badly about people in public, but you shouldn't say anything good about them either, because if you're in a group, then even if you don't, then somebody else will have something to pipe in.
A journalist cannot live by the good rabbi's credo, apparently.
Well,
that's your job.
I think if he was a publisher of a newspaper, it might have had a weather report every day, but that might have been just about it. So, but in fairness and in fullness, even the Chafetz Chaim, who's a great critic of Lashon Hara, had areas where he said it was permissible to make distinctions, and that primarily was in terms of protecting the community. And I don't know if you want to go into it, but I did speak with a rabbinic authority before I published the story, because I knew that somebody's career and life in many ways was at stake here. And just briefly, the criteria that, according to Jewish law, is to do whatever you can to prevent further harm. So the decision was ultimately mine, but the rabbi told me, I think wisely, he said, if there's any way you can prohibit this further action without publishing, then you should do it. But if not, he said, you're not only permitted to, but you're obligated to publish it. And
don't you think it's a little odd to kind of look for signposts about media ethics and halakha? I mean, it really is, the journalist is the modern creature par excellence, or one of them. Do you ever find that that's kind of a tension in your job, that Jewish halakha just doesn't really speak to the types of issues that you face here in the modern world?
Well, I think the tension is always there. And whether it's a Jewish newspaper or maybe it's a little sharper in a religious community, but I think that balance and that tension between overstepping, hurting people's personal lives unnecessarily, and doing what you think is the greater good for the community, I think that tension is always there.
So what was the reaction of your readers to your expose, exposing something very, very difficult and painful for the community to deal with?
I think part of the difficulty for us and for our readers is in some way we're leading them to the mirror and saying, this is the real Jewish community, not necessarily the one we like to think about, that we are one and we only do wonderful things. So when readers are confronted with criticism or difficult issues in the newspaper, I think it's tough for them, and I understand that. But I have to say that the great majority of the response we got was very favorable. It was from the rabbis that we got the most grief.
And what's the structural, in a way you presaged the similar sexual abuse scandal, which is much larger in the Catholic Church. Is there something you learned in 2000 that when these stories broke a few years later in the United States on the Catholic side, you said, yeah, I knew that was going to happen? Was there some institutional reflex that kept
I think there is institutional reflex, and I think we see it, we saw it then, we see it now, and protect your colleague rather than the kids.
Well, we've been speaking to Gary Rosenblatt, editor-in-chief of the Jewish Week. Mr. Rosenblatt, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it.